Hey, how's it going? Welcome back to another video. Have you ever wondered what law school is like? Maybe you're in college, maybe you're in high school, and law school is in your mind about the near future? Well, this video is just for you. So the number one thing I wish I had known before law school was to take everything with a grain of salt. This is very important. So you might get advice from advisors, you might get advice from 2Ls and 3Ls and other people in your own class. But the very most important thing you need to think about is what's best for you. What might work for others may not work for you, and this is extremely important in law school because it can be detrimental if you follow the footsteps of another person and at the end you figure out that it does not simply work for you. Law school, generally speaking, most exams are going to be worth 100% of your grade. So you generally do not know how you're doing along the way until the day of the final comes, or in the final days when you actually eventually study. So it is very important for you to understand what works for you. But don't think that just because I said take it with a grain of salt doesn't mean that you shouldn't listen to anybody or be afraid of what other people might say. But it is very important to find yourself and what works for you. So you might want to listen to what your faculty says, or maybe advisor, maybe upperclassmen, maybe professors, what have you. But always take it with a grain of salt. And you should always analyze how that advice is working for you specifically. Maybe you want to try flashcards, maybe you want to do a bunch of practice. Maybe you just want to sit with your notes. Maybe you want to try just outlines that are way shorter than what your notes are. Maybe you look at outside outlines, but always try to move quickly in determining what works for you because you do not want it to be too late. So the second thing that I wish I had known is that studying is very important. There is a lot of material that you read through, a lot of cases, a lot of notes, but there's one thing that is more important than actually studying, and that's application. You could study all the books in the world, but if you do not understand how to actually apply it, then you will be in trouble. So it's very important for you to understand how every principle or theory or elements or what have you is actually applied, because understanding it might be very different for you than actual application. And that happened to me personally a bunch of times where I thought I understood something and apparently I did not. And luckily for me, I was always analyzing how much I was understanding ahead of time so it didn't catch up to me. Another tip on top of that is when you do study, just because you think you know something doesn't necessarily mean you understand it completely. So just because you know what one element of a crime means, or maybe you understand what negligence means and you could break down the elements, what have you, it does not necessarily mean you understand it. So you should always test yourself to see if you could put it into words. So one way I like to study is to minimize the amount of words it takes to describe a certain term or element. So basically if for example, if we're talking about duty, then I would have a very short sentence from my notes or an outline, whatever, and I would like to pick certain words in the definition that will basically, in my mind, put everything together, and I'll be able to write it out just based on those specific words that are very important to the definition. So that's how I like to memorize things. A lot of people probably reword things in their own words instead of using a very black letter law type definition for things that you like to put in your own words, and that makes it easier to memorize. I do that as well. So it's very important that you know how exactly to put it into words when the test comes. You do not want to put things in words that make no sense. Law is very specific, so you need to be very word specific. So when it comes to descriptions or the way you describe terms or definitions, it's very important that you know exactly how to put it into specific words. You don't want to try to piece together something that might not make sense or might be very close to the definition, but put a weird twist in it where it means something different than what it's actually supposed to mean. So that'll catch up to you and ensure that you do lose points when exams come around. So in terms of actually putting things into practice, it's very important to do practice. It does not mean you need to do every single multiple choice question ever on a topic. It does not mean you have to do endless essays on a certain topic. But especially when it comes to things that you might not understand that well, it is very important to at least look at practice. It does not mean you have to do all of them. What I would like to do is I would rarely do practice essays, but I would always ask my advisor for them. So what I would do is I would look through the essay, and in my mind I would jot down certain ideas where I think the fact pattern is headed, what the analysis might be. I wouldn't necessarily write it out. You could definitely do that. I know a lot of people would. I just like to do it quickly because I would focus more on memorization, and you could easily get through more practice if you don't necessarily write every single little thing out, but it might work better for other people. It just wasn't my thing. So and then after I would do that, I would basically look at the sample answers for all these essays. I'd go through a bunch of essays and I could do it more quickly. And one thing I would do is I would point out certain phrases like elements to a crime, or certain phrases that I liked the wording of in the sample, and I would memorize those certain phrases with the specific keywords just because I like the phrasing, and I would use those on actual essay. Another point I would want to make on that is supplements. This is not something that I would regularly do, but if there is a subject that you do not understand well, or certain concepts, then it would be also helpful not only do practice, but to also have supplements to those. A lot of professors actually will tell you what supplements would be good for their actual subject. So the supplements might vary, so certain professors might recommend ones that will be closer to the way they teach themselves. So that's something to note. Maybe you could ask them about certain supplements if they don't recommend one right off the bat. But supplements might be something you also want to look into just so you have another reference. So number 3, I didn't realize this until one trimester into law school, but it would have been nice if I had known this ahead of time. Barbary does offer a program where they do offer supplements, and this is true for 1L students, 2L students, 3L students. This does not cover every single law subject, but pretty much all the main ones, especially for 1L year, they pretty much cover everything, and this would be a nice supplement to have. In terms of outlines, also lectures and stuff like that. I used it during 1L year. I had also purchased 2L year. I think the 2L year and 3L year came alongside Barbary for bar study, so I didn't necessarily look too into it. But it is there. So that's also something to consider if you are heading into 3L year. If you do get Barbary ahead of time, they will likely throw in a package where they do have like 3L and 2L year courses, which you might be taking during 3L year, depending on how you set up your schedule. So it might be also helpful, and it's like thrown in for free. So that's something nice to have. So the 4th thing that I want to cover, and it's also covered in my misconceptions video, so you should check it out, but it is hard. This might be a no-brainer for most people that are watching this, but you know, there might be people that think they could just beat the system. They think that they're really smart, or maybe like me, they thought that college was super like difficult in terms of like rigor and the way everything was graded. So you might think that law school is just going to be a piece of cake, but that is not the case whatsoever. Even if you had a hard time in college and it was not a piece of cake like it was for me, because of the way everything was graded and the rigor behind everything, it does not mean that law school won't be hard. It still will be hard for 99.9% of people, unless you're some sort of like legal genius ahead of time. Maybe your parents are lawyers and your bedtime story was law books growing up and you just know everything by the time law school rolls around. But for most people that will not be the case. So law school is hard, and you should not underestimate how hard it will be. but it's very important to note that it's hard but not impossible, so you will get through it. The fifth thing I wish I knew was that it does get difficult, and this is somewhat related to my point previously, but there is a lot of competition. This is not something I necessarily knew going into it, that there'd be so much competition. I did not know that there were curves. I think my first year curve was at 70%, so essentially there would be a bunch of people that would fail every class or get a D or F just to balance out the curve, since it was set at 70% flat. So there is a lot of competition. It's not like people are going to go around like tearing your like work and your notes and stuff like that. It's not that crazy, but there is a lot of competition. So if you are competitive in nature, then this will be a perfect fit for you. I know for me personally, I was competitive growing up and through like high school especially, so this was kind of my element, but I didn't really get into it until like later on, where you felt like you're competing with other students and you needed to keep up and a lot of times actually beat them. So even if you weren't even if you did not have this like negative mindset where you're trying to like ruin people's lives or anything like that, it's nothing like to that extent, but it does hype you up a little bit to know that you have to compete with the people around you and you do need to do as well as them, if not a lot better. So the sixth thing I wish I knew before I went into law school is cold calling. I had no idea what cold calling was. A lot of you might not know what it is. So cold calling is basically when a professor randomly calls on somebody in the crowd, no matter how big this lecture hall is. It could be 200 people. In ours, a lot of our classes, I think in 1L year, I think the most was like about 70-ish. And you would think that you could just easily blend in just because there's so many students, but that is not the case whatsoever when it comes to cold calling. And during 1L year, professors loved it. It might not be crazy like you might have seen in movies where they make you stand up. At least in my case, our professors weren't like that. They would not make you stand up, but they do take cold calling seriously. So they would randomly call on somebody in the crowd. And more than one person would obviously be called on. Usually you would get one case and you would have to describe whatever they would ask you about the case. Usually it's off your brief. So that's another thing. If you had your briefs, then that would give you some preparation, but obviously you might not be able to anticipate any specific question they might ask, since they might go like beyond what a case brief would ask you for, like the nitty-gritty stuff. So cold calling was something I did not know about. If I did, it probably would have given me anxiety, so it's probably good that I did not know about it until after I already jumped into law school. So the seventh thing I wish I knew when I went to law school was to always make sure that you understand the material. Most classes will just have a final, unless your professor is being nice. Maybe you'll get a midterm thrown in, but even then, usually midterms aren't going to be worth much. So at the end of the day, the final might be worth 100% most of the time, and maybe like 80-70% the rest of the time. So it's a big deal no matter what. And it is very important to make sure that you understand the material. You do not want to fall behind. You want to make sure that you understand it to enough of a degree that you can keep moving and build on top of that knowledge, and by the time the end comes, you completely understand it, and maybe not even completely, but like you understand it to like a 80-90% scale, especially when the end comes and it's time to ask professors questions about certain topics. You want to know what to ask. If you did not study along the way, then you wouldn't know what to ask. You don't want to roll around finals week or the day of the final to figure out that there's a bunch of stuff you don't understand. There is a fair chance that it might not even be tested, so you'll get off lucky, but you do not want to run that risk. It is very important to understand what the professor goes through as they're going through it. So always keep that in mind. Remember to share, like, and subscribe. There is another law school video in the description below, so please check that out. It is on misconceptions about law school, so it's pretty much just as important as this video. They don't necessarily deal with the same information, so please check that out.